the editor-in-chief of BNE Intellinews. Dave, can you, Chris, take away the shared screen? Or can you see me? Chris, can you see me?
Yeah, I can see you. You're on full screen. I got you.
Right. So I'm here today with an old friend, Chris Weaver, who has been, how shall I say, head of research at pretty much every Russian bank they ever invented, and has been in Moscow for decades. I have an announcement. Unfortunately, Fedor and Tom have withdrawn. All I can say about that is that when we set this up, it was pre-war, and now the war has started, and in Moscow, things are kind of fraught. And I don't think anyone actually wants to be, well, put it this way, I think they've decided to keep a low profile for the meantime until things become a bit clearer.
Sorry, Ben, you're muted on Spaces.
I'm muted on Spaces. 1 second. No, it says my microphone is on. Can you hear me now, Dave?
I can't hear anything. I don't know.
Maybe it's an issue there. I can hear you through the Spaces as well as the computer. So for me, it's okay.
Yeah. No, and when I speak, it says it's working. Excuse us, everyone. Just a few technical things. I think it's all right.
Maybe my phone's just being weird. Sorry.
All right. No, it looks okay to me. So let's dive in. As I say, I wanted to have a slightly broader discussion, but Chris is a real veteran of the market, and from positions as head of research at Sberbank, for example, he's well connected in the government and talks to those people, and is well placed to comment on all of this. And I think maybe we can have a nice open discussion about what's going on, because everybody was shocked by the events of the last 48 hours. We were arguing from the beginning that Putin was very committed to the idea of getting his security deal, and that the Russian side tried very hard to do this diplomatically with 2 rounds. They issued demands in December. And that sparked the meetings in January that was mainly aimed at doing a deal with the White House on the basis of guarantee of no NATO. However, by the end of the month, the White House made it very clear that they weren't prepared to negotiate on that point. They see it as a matter of principle, which is fair enough. I mean, given we were not dealing with Yalta and spheres of influence anymore, but we've had the Helsinki process, and we're supposed to be civilized nations where we respect each other's sovereignty. And then there was a second stream of diplomacy, which started in February with Macron. And that one shifted the focus to implementing the Minsk II deal. And that has a built-in default mechanism that, in effect, also gives Russia a veto over Ukraine joining, in so much as the idea of that is to make Donbass autonomous. And that hands them the possibility to veto a referendum to join NATO. And given that Russia is, in effect, in control of the Donbass, the Kremlin would have accepted that. However, Zelensky 10 days ago on that Friday made it very clear he's not going to do it. As far as, everybody wants to do Minsk II, but for Kiev, it's a crap deal. And even Poroshenko, who signed off of it, never attempted to implement it. They didn't like it, but it did have the effect of stopping the hot war in 2014 and turning it into a frozen conflict. And the next day, after Zelensky said, no, it's a vapid idea and it's a useless waste of time, I'm not going to do it, then the fighting in Donbass immediately flared up. And 2 days later, Russian troops crossed the border. And all hell has broken loose. So where do we go from here? Chris, I mean, do you agree with that analysis? Because although everyone was caught out by the invasion, I mean, I was saying from the beginning, look, it's a real possibility. Putin's not going to let this go. For him, it's a legacy issue, dealing with Ukraine. And if he has to go to war, he will. And I think the precedent here, normally he's a slow, careful planner. But the Crimea showed us that when he occasionally, when he thinks it's important, he will act. and he'll act very boldly indeed. And he's just done it for a second time.
Sure.
So we shouldn't have been surprised. What do you think?
Well, I looked at clearly, I certainly am amongst those who are surprised at the speed at which things changed from, kind of negotiating, threatening to this hot war that we now have. But like you, not surprised that we've got to this point. And in fact, I would go further to say that I think the reason why it has accelerated is because the Kremlin, I think, it sees that there's a window of opportunity that will close. In other words, they might be able to do more now that they might not be able to later. And what I mean by that is that, when President Biden became president and the two presidents met in June last year, Putin came away from that definitely with the view that he could do a deal or get a deal done with Biden, because Biden made very public that he had two priorities. One was containing China, and the other was re-engaging with Europe and kind of making, kind of settling relations with Russia, rather than improving relations with Russia, but making that a little bit more predictable and stable was something that he also wanted to achieve. So President Putin's interpretation of that was, well, we might get a deal with this guy, and so it's been building since then. Because remember, during President Trump's time, this would not be possible whatsoever, and also as we get towards the summer, President Biden's hands will be tied even more, because the US will move into the pre-election period, the midterm elections, and anything that he does on the external front will have enormous implications domestically and could be a factor in the election. So he would need to avoid that. Hence, you have this window where Russia really stepped up the diplomatic pressure on the US. And also remember, we had a brand new government in Germany where the slate, I wouldn't say it was wiped clean, but certainly reset to some extent. And that also potentially offered an opportunity. And also President Macron, as we've seen, he's also up for election, he's up for election in April. And, having some wins on the international side, I guess, would help him. So Russia factored these in terms of the timing. And I absolutely agree with you. It's also part of Putin's legacy planning. We've seen a lot of that happening inside Russia over the last couple of years, the constitutional changes, that changes the role of the Duma, extensive changes in the way the governors are appointed and managed and monitored. And we know that there's ongoing discussions about, our ongoing changes within security forces and other changes that are to come as part of this kind of legacy transition. Not that Putin is planning to retire anytime soon, but he definitely appears to be in a kind of transition preparation mode. So dealing with this open wound as far as he's concerned, and it's something that's been bugging him for the 20 years he's been in the office, 22. He spelled it out very explicitly at the Munich conference in 2007. So this is always something he wanted wrapped up, before he eventually leaves office. And say the timing, I think, is because he sees the window where he might be able to cut a deal with Biden, and hence the focus was
exactly.
But I agree with you. We heard from him on Monday that he simply has lost any faith that a deal was possible, that he felt.
Well, I was going to ask you. Before we go on, I want to say to the audience on Zoom, if you have questions or things you'd like to hear about, there's the chat function. Please use it. You can type your questions in there, and we'll keep an eye on it and maybe address those as we go, or have a look at them at the end. But Chris, to come back to the point, I mean, I agree. The Merkel's departure sort of left Europe headless. The Russians made it very clear that they want to do a deal with the States, and we just had Biden come in. So he was saying himself, diplomacy is back. And I also agree that probably he's the most dovish US president on Russia we've had in a very long time. The first thing he did was put the START 3 deals into place, whereas America has been withdrawing from those deals continuously since whenever it was, 2003, and the ABM, which started that off, which freaked the Russians out. So given everything was aligned, that Europe was prepared to follow the US lead, that Biden was here to establish himself and has been very actively taking up that role, and that he's a dove, and that there's real common ground. I mean, following the Ministry of Foreign Affairs 8 demands, everybody agreed. I mean, Lavrov said too, like, actually, there's a lot of common ground here we can do on arms control and cyber attacks and terrorism and money laundering, which is actually a Putin thing too. Where did it go wrong? Why has it gone so badly wrong? The simple explanation is that it's all about NATO, and Putin refuses to talk about anything unless we talk about that first. And it's that simple.
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right. It is. It's about Russia's border security, and we've seen him. I've heard him many times with his irritation of what NATO was doing in the Baltics, and I think the penultimate straw, if you like, was the British warship sailing through Crimea waters, and the last straw was those Turkish-made drones, which, of course, according to Russian media, were NATO-made drones. Striking targets inside Donbass last, I think it was October. And so it's kind of brought it to a head also with those other timing issues that I mentioned. And people I talked to in Russian government Moscow always said, even back then, that this would have to be wrapped up by the end of Q1. And it's because they felt that the window of opportunity for getting a deal would be closed, or would start to close. And the longer they left it, it would be possible. And we heard this from Putin then on Monday. He basically said was there's no point in continuing talks because we're not going to get anywhere. The talks are just dragging on and being delayed. And so and he's lost patience. And of course we've had this. Well, at the time, of course, we thought, well, losing patience just means that this is going to, act out in a fairly fractious way over a period of time, not a period of days. So that's been a surprise.
What do you think, though? There's two ways of looking at it. I mean, my argument is that Putin has been planning this for a long time, and he could see how it's going to go. He could see that no NATO guarantee was going to be extremely hard sell. And then he could use that as a hard position and then retreat once tensions got very high and push for the West to force Minsk II on Zelensky, get them to do the hard work, because obviously Zelensky's not going to listen to what Russia says. But if he's got Macron and Scholz and Biden all telling him to do Minsk II, then he might have been persuaded to do it. Having said that, if that failed, then I think the military option had been planned and settled and decided from the beginning. But James Bruce has put up a question that there's also a take on it whereby Putin's backed himself into a corner here, and the military thing is like his way of getting out. It's like a caged bear. And The Economist ran a cover the same 2 weeks ago, I think it was, with Putin painting himself into a corner. I just totally disagree with that, but it's a common view. What do you think of that?
Well, look, I don't think that's the view in Moscow whatsoever. I guess that's the view, obviously when you're looking in at Russia, but in Russia, they don't see that whatsoever, because I think you're quite right, is that they pursued this kind of pressure and absolutely, it was negotiations with Washington and with Europe and hoping that would then put the pressure on Kiev to get what Russia wanted. Russia had never any kind of basis of hope of negotiating directly with Ukraine. It was always indirectly through Washington. We've heard that from Lavrov and a few other people as well. So I think you're right. It was either one or the other. And given that that Putin is planning this transition, and this is a kind of an open wound, this security issue that he definitely wanted to suture before he ends. I think you're right that the military option was always planned, and he doesn't see it as painting himself into the corner. I think they've been preparing for this. Now, when we look at what's happening in the economy, you can definitely interpret what Russia's been doing policy-wise the last several years as part of preparation. And I know it's easier in hindsight to connect the dots in the rear mirror, but remember a couple of years ago, the IMF and the World Bank were highly critical of Russia, the fact that it was far too conservative in its fiscal policies. Was building up too much financial reserves, had plenty of capacity for debt, and should have been spending more to try and revive the economy. And the government refused to do so. And now one explanation is that because it was building up this kind of financial reserve in order that it can survive, this onslaught of Western sanctions without risking any. I know that's kind of a little bit of connecting, 2 and 2 makes 4 with the benefit of hindsight, but it does kind of make sense. And it does, therefore, answer your question about, that Putin has not found himself inexplicably in a corner. I think that there's definitely an element of planning here. And now, of course, we're still guessing as to what the end game will be.
What's the mood then in the government circles? I mean, because no one wanted to go here. It was quite obvious what was going to happen.
When you say no one, I think that's what has become obvious for a while, and certainly now, is that the people who have kind of the president's ear are much more on the hawkish side, more the security, Siloviki as people of power, to explain that. They have Putin's ear, whereas the previously kind of the more liberal faction, those who are more involved with economic matters, former Finance Minister Kudrin and Anatoly Chubais and people like that, they all previously would have had an input into policy, and their voice would have been heard. And it seems quite clear that since Crimea and since sanctions started, their influence has deteriorated to the point that they do not have a voice now. And I think we've been hearing that, this is part of the argument that Siloviki, hawkish people have been saying to the president, is that, look, we tried opening to the West, we've engaged with the West, and look what they've done to us, so why bother anymore?
It occurred to me that one way of looking at this is that in the Soviet Union, they sacrificed the comfort, of the people, prosperity, and so we had these exploding tellies in order to build the machine for the security. So we had world-class fighter jets. And in a way, the same thing's just happened. And Kudrin sort of represents that capitalism, and the whole process with rearming the military, modernizing the military, started in 2012, and it began with Kudrin getting sacked because he was against it, diverting all the money to the military.
Yes.
In that sense, we've had a return now to Soviet thinking, where Putin is actually sacrificing the prosperity of the country and the people in order to achieve his geopolitical goals. And the stock market's crashed, and the incomes have been stagnant for 6 years. And he doesn't really care. He just has to keep enough to keep the people happy.
Well, you see, this is, and you're right. And this, I think, is the flaw. Or maybe it's me being wishful thinking, because remember, we're all going to remember that we've been there for 24 years, but you're still a foreigner, etc., hired gun, and so you've got to be wary of preaching, etc. But it certainly is my view, and a view that's built up over years, is that if there is a miscalculation in Putin's thinking, it will be that concerning the compliance of people. And I think that you can see that over the last couple of decades there has been an enormous change in the demographics in Russia. There you see more people who were born, at the end of the Soviet Union, who are now in their 20s or even their 30s. They have their own families. Their concerns are more about lifestyle, about social support, about job security, the future for their children. Very different to the attitude of maybe their parents and certainly their grandparents, who would be much more supportive of the government and non-questioning. But you've now got a different generation that have grown up with the internet, they've grown up with foreign travel, they have expectations of life. And you take that away, and now we see some of the sanctions that have been applied, for example, the restrictions on Russian banks, which we don't know as yet, but it might mean that a Russian issued credit card or your bank card from your spare bank or VTP machine may not work on a foreign ATM, which means you can't go on holidays. You can also see the inflationary impacts from the weak ruble and other factors. This level of sanctions we're seeing now will have a much greater impact on the broader population than anything we've seen before, not immediately, but over time. And therefore, the question I'm posing is, will that kind of previously very stable, almost indifferent social political dynamic that the Kremlin has always relied on, will that now come under severe strain as people start to reject that sort of political ideology because it's hitting their lifestyle? And that's a risk the Kremlin is taking.
But that leads to protests. I want to come to protests and the potential and the link to sanctions in a minute. But let's broach the main question here, that Putin's crossed the border into Ukraine, and the military operation is underway. However, it's not clear at all what the goal is here. What does Putin want to achieve? And the two big camps, well, there's three main points. There's a possibility of occupying Ukraine. There's a possibility of regime change. And there's a possibility of taking Donbass and making it into a little country, which would guarantee NATO. And this is all being thrown into sharp relief by what's happening in Kiev. There were rocket attacks. There was a report of an APC approaching the city. There were some reports of Russian soldiers in the city, but I think those have been dismissed in the meantime. What do you think the end goal here is? What is Putin going to do with Ukraine? He said this morning, and Lavrov repeated, that there was no intention of occupying it. But what does he get out of it?
Yeah, look, this is an extremely difficult question, of course, because had we had this conversation this day last week, I think most of us would have given a very low probability of what we're seeing right now. But it is what it is, and I think that there are the three options, as you say: occupy the country and try and control it. I don't see that, because that would just ensure, kind of almost an incremental increase in the financial pain, the sanctions pain, etc. And Russia probably wouldn't be able to do it in terms of controlling a country like that.
Yeah, you could take Ukraine, but you can't control it. The insurrection,
it would just drain the country, and
it would be in Afghanistan.
And probably eventually wouldn't work anyway. You'd have to, Anyway, so I think that's least likely. The two more likely ones are that they force a regime change and then either draw a line down the Dnipro River and divide the country into east and west, and Russia essentially says the eastern part is ethnically Russian and this is where we're staying, and you've got a natural barrier with the river that splits the country in half and runs down the eastern side of Kiev. Or if Russia is satisfied with regime change, kind of a government that they might have to deal with, then possibly they could pull back to the greater Donbass region, which of course is a lot bigger than that area occupied by the separatists. I'm inclined to think that they would their objective is to force regime change, and then. But
how would that work? I mean, the thing is,
I don't know. This is what they keep saying. They want regime change. They want a neutral government. I guess the one alternative is that you get the government, Zelensky's government, agreeing to some sort of peace terms, which then leads to maybe some constitutional change that guarantees. But that could always be reversed. So
Putin said the other day that neutrality, if they abandon their NATO aspirations and adopt a policy of neutrality, then he would accept that would do.
Yeah,
and you don't have to change the regime in order to, because the thing with regime change, I mean, we're talking about Ukraine. This is a country now that has a democratic tradition. Moreover, it's got a very active civil society and a population that protests. This country is already ousted 2 crap presidents, and if you try to put a Putin puppet on the throne,
it's not going to work, is it?
It's not going to work.
No,
Ukrainians know how to do this,
No, this is it, and so look, this is why it's difficult to call it, because on the one hand, I think we agree that it would be quite stupid for Russia to try and control the whole country all the way to the Polish border and maintain that control. It just would be crippling and so ridiculous in so many ways. That's not to say, as I say, it wouldn't happen or it wouldn't try it, but I think even Putin's advisors would advise against that. And then the question is, how do you might put a puppet government in place, but you say it lasts 5 minutes after you leave.
The entire population would be on the streets. It would be,
of course. So it may well be. That's why I think that in terms of alternatives, the other alternative is that you literally take half the country, split by the river, and you're there as a constant threat.
Surely the goal,
abandon neutrality, we're just over the river. So that's possibly maybe.
The goal is a step short of that. I mean, to pressure Zelensky's government into making this change, declaring neutrality. And you can threaten to take half.
And then you keep the threat by essentially being close by. And you've already, Russia's already shown that we'll obviously come across the border if our security is threatened. You've agreed neutrality, and we're just going to be over the river. And one assumes, therefore, that Ukraine post a deal like that would get enormous amount of financial and trade support, trade integration with Europe. But the condition being then that deal would remain in place, because nobody wants a war in Europe.
let me float my pet theory of what's going to happen, which I think ticks the boxes. And my working assumption, the basic assumption is this is all about NATO, Russia's security, keeping Ukraine out.
Yeah.
And one way you could do that is you could do this attack, spread the army out, but then very rapidly overrun Donbass as a region. And because they've already accepted and recognized its autonomy, then you create this little country. But then you have what the Russians see as a legitimate government, so that those could invite the Russians in. And so for the first time, they could openly be there, and moreover, invite them to set up a military base. And then what you have is a fortified enclave inside Ukraine, protected by the Russians who are going to claim that it's legitimate. But they have openly military, which makes it impossible for Kiev to attack it without starting an open war with Russia again. And then Putin's got what he wants, because nobody in the world is going to recognize this. And it's gone from a frozen conflict where the Russians are pretending they're not there to a much more stable situation where Russians just basically build a fence along the edge of the Donbass and put lots of tanks in there so that no one attacks it. But because it's a disputed border, and it will be in perpetuity, you then have guarantee that Ukraine cannot join NATO, because you can't join NATO if you have a disputed border for 5 reasons. And that actually solves everything. I mean, the fighting that needs to be done in order to capture the Donbass is limited, can be done relatively quickly. Putin gets his NATO guarantee. He takes the sanctions as the price of that, but then he's actually got his security, because I think at the bottom line, he is absolutely terrified of seeing NATO missiles on the Ukrainian border, 5 minutes flight time, 80% of the population. And that's his goal, and that would actually solve all the problems. So do you think that's, I think that's the most likely.
But the trouble with that is that he could have done that relatively quickly, without this further incursion into Ukraine and the outskirts of Kiev right now. So, okay, I could still buy it, because
doesn't that stop Ukraine bringing and massing its whole army on the Donbass border? If you went straight to Donbass,
it does. But and I guess we saw this play out in a much a more minor way. And I apologize, but if there's anybody from Georgia listening, I don't mean to understate what happened in August 2008, but it was kind of back then, as we all recall, the Russian military invaded. Obviously, they say it was in retaliation, but it doesn't matter. They invaded, and they came all the way to the outskirts of Tbilisi, and they hit Georgians' military installations, and then they went back to the border of Abkhazia.
Charlie Robertson said that too, and they also had the opportunity to regime change Saakashvili, and they didn't do that
so
either.
It's therefore, as of now, we're still in that playbook where they are striking very hard at Ukrainian military, making a point, and then to say if they were to pull back to either the east side of the river or to the Donbass region, then that would leave a much more a firmer message than just simply coming up to the border and looking over at Ukrainian troops, because that clearly would have left the legacy of conflict, arising by accident. Whereas now, if they do pull back, so I see what you're saying, and it's definitely, and you know what, given where we're at right now, I hope that's what happens, because that obviously would be the least damaging of next steps.
And the least number of people would die. Yeah.
It does make sense in the way you describe it. And we have seen it play out in Georgia. And, the sanctions that we've had thus far, painful as they are. But, the thing that everybody should remember about sanctions this week, and I'm not sure whether this is just by coincidence or by planning, but the fact that all of this is playing out in a week when the US Congress is in recess on holidays means that the sanctions that have now been signed off in the US are executive branch sanctions. In other words, they're the president has signed them at his own discretion. It means that the president can withdraw those if he thinks that circumstances have changed. It's entirely his discretion. Whereas if Congress was in session, they would have moved quickly with the Menendez bill. That would have therefore been legislated. It would become law, and it will never be withdrawn, because we've seen that play out when Congress will never reduce sanctions against Russia. So the fact that these are presidential discretion sanctions means that they can be negotiated down later
So-
in exactly the same way as Europe has done. So I don't know whether it's clever planning or coincidence, but it makes a big difference in terms of what happens next.
So you think, because I watched the Biden presser, really rowdy one, and one of the questions he was asked was that why isn't Putin personally being sanctioned? Because in the Menendez bill, there is a list and everyone's in there, including Putin, and he wouldn't be drawn. He dodged the question. And again, coming out of Kiev, they're not happy in so much as they think the sanctions are far too soft. They want to see SWIFT, they want to see oil and gas bans, they want the whole 9 yards.
Of
And
course.
it does look like Biden is pulling his punches to some extent. And
Well, he has no choice.
Why
There's
keep
no
anything in
choice.
reserve now?
No, well, first of all, there is something, SWIFT or whatever might be say it's in reserve, but they're not in reserve in reality. The reality is that when you cut through the politics and you look at the real world, Europe is dependent on Russian energy. That's a fact. And they can talk all they like about, finding alternative sources. It is not possible. I mean, if there was an energy disruption, a gas particularly tomorrow, then yes, Europe could ride through it until the autumn, until the winter, perhaps. In other words, maybe in the rest of this year, where reserves are quite high. But they, everybody agrees. And there's been a couple of reports on this from very obviously authoritative places like Wood Mackenzie, whatever, essentially all saying the same thing, is the picture would be very different next spring, and Europe would run into an energy crisis by next spring at the latest. It would mean industries shutting down, particularly across Germany.
Rolling blackouts. We've written about it too.
You would have
it's
a
not
recession
possible.
in Europe, then it would it probably then cause a global recession. So in other words, you simply can't do it. And you can blame dependency all you like, but it doesn't matter. The fact is that's the way it is today.
Yeah.
So even if Europe, and of course the other thing that makes me smile, I don't mean in such a serious context, but when people are being deliberately selective of information or maybe haven't done their research properly, and you get people saying, well, you look, LNG is great, look how much LNG Europe is importing. And therefore that can be, a substitute for Russian gas. And they don't look up the fact that the biggest supplier of LNG for the last 2 years is Russia into Europe. It used to be the US, but now it's Russia.
But isn't it the 200 BCMs of gas that go from Russia to Europe? I mean, that's a third of the global LNG production. Yeah. And you can't take that and then third of the production because you cause an energy crisis in Asia as well.
Exactly. And actually one of the reasons why gas reservoirs are now, kind of near the average is because there actually has been, a much milder winter in Asia, which has allowed LNG shipments then to go to Europe. But you get a normal, say, winter in Asia, then there's that won't happen, and that's why the project say, well, you might just about muddle through for a few months, but a crisis.
The gas is also an argument why you can't take out SWIFT, because I mean I talked to Alina Rybkovka, and she said like, well, if you turn off SWIFT, then Germany cannot pay for its gas. So
exactly,
again,
you're breaching contracts. Yeah, and this is. This is the one thing about Putin, and there's that we've observed over the last 20 years. And I remember one of my former bosses would always preach to me. He said, "Never look for a plan, look for convictions." And there are certain things that Putin personally believes in, and they do crop up in policy and direct policy. And one of those, for example, is this conservative approach that he's had towards the budget and towards saving. He doesn't like borrowing money. He likes to have plenty of money in the bank in case there's a rainy day, whether he causes it or not, it doesn't matter. So, he supported Kudrin's efforts in terms of budget restraint, creating the national fund. He preached against debt. We heard that a lot in 2009 when Russian companies were caught offside with foreign debt and the currency devalued, and you had to bail them out. So, this constant preaching about being conservative and reducing your exposure to foreign debt, but also contracts have to be honored. And I know people might cynically laugh at that given what's happening, but there are two sides to this guy, and he has constantly preached about if you have a contract, you honor it. So
that's a legacy from the 70s when the gas business was set up. It's always been have to be reliable. Because I was just reading this morning that ironically the war has started, and yet transit of Russian gas through Ukraine has suddenly jumped from whatever it was, 23 thousand to 60 just in the last few days while the fighting's going on.
Yeah, and I think, Russia's making a point, as it were. We are a reliable energy partner, and we will remain so, provided you honor your side of the contract, which is you pay us, then we will deliver. And,
isn't that because they've got 100 years of gas in Yamal, and that's all bottled up and really can only go through the northern routes into Germany? That gas very hard to sell to China.
Yeah, or you more expensive infrastructure, and you end up with power of Siberia 5, 6, and 7. Never mind 1 and 2. But I think the other reason, and again, just pure guesswork, but I'll throw it out there, as to why they're increasing gas flow to Ukraine is they're making a point that if there was a friendlier government in Kiev, or a government that wasn't hostile to Russia, then Russia could continue using the Druzhba pipeline and could put a lot more gas through it than it currently is, irrespective of Nord Stream 2. So, I think somebody's just making a subtle point. But the main one is that we're not going to disrupt energies just because we're at war, because we are a reliable supplier.
I think only the bankers have noticed. I haven't seen anybody report it, although we're going to write it up. Just a quick one, a very specific one, because there's a lot of talk and the reporting coming out of Kiev. There was reports of rockets and some reports of soldiers. Do you think that the Russian will attempt to take Kiev? Do you think it's possible?
I would have thought not possible, frankly. You could certainly control key parts of the infrastructure. You can turn the lights on and off, control the transport links in and out, the rail links, the road links, the airport. But in terms of taking the city, in terms of occupation, where you control everything and the people, no, I would have thought that was.
It's a huge time. It'd take months, wouldn't it? I mean,
absolutely.
Fighting.
You and I have been in Kiev lots of times, and you think, well, how in God's earth would you even do this? But you can control the infrastructure, and I guess that's how you do it. You control the TV tower, you control the rail station, you control the major junctions, but that's not really controlling the city. It just gives you temporary management, over a brief period of time.
Well, Klitschko just handed out 10,000 firearms yesterday. So there's a lot of armed people there.
Yeah, absolutely. And anybody who can get a weapon can use it, etc. So, I would have thought we are now getting at this point where, I go back to your theory, Russia has clearly made a very strong point, has been punished for it. But if it were to kind of now, kind of withdraw into the east, then the legacy it's a game changer in the sense that, Russia's grievances would have to be taken more seriously, and the Russian threat would have to be taken seriously because they could come back. But anyway, we'll see.
Jim Ensel has asked the question, your views on if there's any read-through to China and the China-Taiwan dispute, because that's in the background, and the Chinese are obviously watching this closely, and they're not going to harm themselves by supporting Russia, but they in principle put themselves behind Russia and said, like, we think Russia has legitimate security concerns, and they're the same concerns we have. Is there any read-through to Taiwan and China on this?
Well, yes and no. I mean, it is by no accident or coincidence that China is emphasizing Russia's security concerns. It is not supporting the Russian, invasion or not, annexation. They did support Crimea because of the historic, links between Russia and Crimea, which has got the analogy, of course, of China and Taiwan. So Crimea, Russia is very similar to Taiwan, China in the minds of people in Beijing. So they supported that, but they do not support, Russia kind of invading and occupying Ukraine, but instead they emphasize Russia's legitimate security concerns, and of course that's what they are. But in terms of a read-through to Taiwan, maybe, and again, look, we're going off in a stretch here, but I think the fact that the Europe and the US backed away from Ukraine support very quickly, and I guess the fact that this may have maybe encouraged speed of what the Kremlin has done or not, again, who knows. But as soon as there's a sign of trouble, the U.S. embassy decamps to Lviv and then into Poland. Biden makes clear that no U.S. troops would go into Ukraine. Others withdrew their forces. It's after very quickly, once it became clear that this invasion threat was happening. So the Chinese may therefore say, well, you know what, that's what's going to happen to Taiwan. because there is no defense agreement between the US and Taiwan. There is a support agreement and a military support agreement, but not a defense cooperation. In other words, the US is not obliged or obligated to go in to defend Taiwan if China invades. They give them plenty of encouragement and support and sanction China. So maybe they will look at this, how it plays out and the playbook, and that might then influence what China does next in Taiwan. But the fact that the West did not, stand up to Russia with military, China will definitely factor that into whatever it's thinking about Taiwan.
You could argue, I think, extremely strongly now that Putin's made a definitive break with the West, in so much as everyone, talking to my German diplomat friends here, the shock of Crimea, they thought, yeah, look, Russia's difficult, it's corrupt, Yeltsin's drunk all the time, it's kind of crazy, Putin, we're not so sure about him. However, we have a relationship, we're doing lots of business there, and it's just going to take time to sort out. And then came Crimea, and everyone was in shock, and they thought, we were not expecting that, grabbing territory, and it fundamentally changed things. However, since then, there's been this sort of pragmatic, kind of prickly relationship where, it's a sort of polite incivility between Russia, and there's been no admission that it's an enemy. And I think that's what's changed now, is that it's an enemy, that it's a military invader and threatener of other people's, and we're all at threat. And so all of that stuff that stands behind NATO suddenly becomes real again, that NATO is actually, we need it because we have an enemy again.
Yeah.
Overtly.
Oh God, yeah. It's a godsend to the Western defense companies. Yeah. Suddenly when they were Afghanistan is finished, and wow, now we have another one. Yeah. So
do you think? But the relationship with China, is been pragmatic, but to what extent is this going to split the world? Because the Chinese are backing the Russians in so much as they have the same beef with the States, that it's a unipolar power, that we want Taiwan back, and the States are going to interfere with that. And the two of them are being driven together, so that, and for Russia strategically, that makes sense, because, Biden's made it clear, I want to get rid of the Russian problem so I can focus on the Chinese problem. But if the China says, right now it's us and Russia, so you haven't got rid of one problem, you just made your existing problem even bigger. And moreover, you're saying one of the two of us is an enemy. Is that playing out, or are Beijing's always going to be, now we go slower, quieter, don't really care about Russia?
I'm definitely more inclined towards the latter view. Obviously, it suits China to criticize the US and NATO for, as we've heard from their foreign ministry, they ignored. Their statement says that NATO and the West ignored Russia's legitimate concerns, and their inactions have led to this situation. So that's the Chinese foreign ministry view for sure. And to the extent that this is causing great discomfort in the West, clearly that suits Beijing. They can sit back and watch this play out. But I still don't see any scenario where, Russia, for example, completely abandons the West and becomes, much more dependent to China. And ends up in this kind of, again, the cliche that I talked about, China's little brother. Moscow doesn't want that. Right now, it suits them, to have this growing relationship with China, and it allows them to diversify their trade and business risk. Because remember, in 2014, as Europeans were complaining about the dependency on Russian energy, and the vulnerability to Russian energy, Moscow also woke up to the fact that, we're just as exposed to revenues from one source, and we need to do something about it. And arguably, Russia has been more successful in diversifying its customer base for energy than Europe has been. And one of the reasons for that is because of Western sanctions forced Russia into a faster pace that might otherwise have happened. But I definitely see Russia's view of China as one of, diversification of certainly where they've been able to, tap into China's resources.
Well, that's going to go much faster now.
But I do think there's a line.
You saw that speech by Miller, I think it was in September, where he was banging on about China, and he got really excited. He said, this is enormous, the potential here.
Well, of course, yeah, because he's Gazprom, and they're their big customer base is Europe, and therefore they're completely vulnerable. And now they have a second one where they can balance one against the other. So of course, that's absolutely perfect for Gazprom if you look at that company on its own. Mr. Sechin has a different view. Of course, he's always very pro-China, and of course they have the big oil pipeline. But Mr. Sechin actually wants to sell gas to Europe. And of course, one of the options for Nord Stream 2, if and when it gets viable, in order to comply with the European Energy Directive, then Gazprom will only be able to fill 50% of that pipe, and Mr. Sechin will be ready to fill the other 50%. So really, it's about diversification. It's not about we now think China is our best friend and not Europe. It's because they want two best friends and not one.
Let's come back briefly and take a quick look at the domestic political situation. In so much as Russia marched into Ukraine at 5 a.m. in the morning yesterday, and then by the early evening there were protests in 50 cities, and 1,700 people were reported arrested. And that this is not a popular war with the Russian people. No. They don't like it. They don't think they should be there. Which means that if Putin's going for like an occupation strategy or holding the whole of eastern Ukraine, not just the Donbass, then that's going to be a protracted war. It's going to go on for a while. And that surely at home, this is the protests are going to get louder and louder. And so much as this could undo Putin. I mean, he could actually finally face his color revolution.
Well, it certainly is a risk, and I think it's something that clear that the Kremlin is becoming more and more worried about. So this changing demographic that I mentioned a couple of years ago. I remember when we had that proposal in the Duma, I think it was in June 2019, to look at probably limiting the foreign ownership of Yandex. And of course that played out. And really what it was about was the government forcing Yandex management to accept an editorial board where they could have more control over the content of Yandex. And that all came from a big independent survey that was just published in the spring of 19, which essentially the grab all headline was 60% of everybody under the age of 36 got their news on political opinion from internet sources and not from mainstream media. And Mr. Kirienko just blew a fuse and wanted control of the internet, etc. So they've been aware about this changing dynamic for a while. And I absolutely agree with you. A projected war that leads to a steady stream of casualties coming home is something that would unravel this kind of stable social political dynamic that we've had. We saw it at the Second Chechen War. I mean, 20 years ago, remember this movement, the Mothers Against War, were protesting, and it led to an acceleration to get
Soldiers'
that war
Mothers.
ended.
It was called Soldiers' Mothers. No,
Soldiers' Mothers. Yeah, exactly. So it led to real efforts by the government to bring that war to an end. And it's one of the reasons people argue is why Russian forces didn't go into Syria in any great numbers, only military or air force, because they are wary of that. So I really do think that the Kremlin will factor that in. And one of the reasons why I agree with you, it's much less likely that they will try to occupy the whole country over a period of time, because it will lead to a steady of casualties coming home, and it will definitely accelerate those protests. Already that balance is more delicate than it was 20 years ago, because people have changed and they've grown up and they've more demands, and they're more interested in healthcare and job security than they are in geopolitics, and are less willing to accept whatever the government tells them, and would be more willing to react against that. So okay, what we're seeing in terms of protests now, I think that's kind of like, I would call that the Navalny effect, which is that you're always able to get a certain number of people out across the country in relatively small numbers, but with a much more amplified voice. In other words, they're very active and very savvy on social internet, and therefore the impression is that it's much more widespread and much more well supported than it actually is. But I think the real issue is that the groundswell of people who are younger or even middle-aged, if their lives are more adversarially affected by what's happening for something that they really don't support, and I think that's clear, this is not Crimea, then that starts to change the dynamic. And
it's there, but it's probably not explosive. I mean, I don't think it's enough
not unless the economy deteriorates. And I think this is why energy prices are the government's ability to fund subsidies and to support families.
Let's cover that.
That's
I mean,
important.
we're in the home straight, and I wanted also briefly to look at the economy and the effect of the sanctions, and that everybody's been saying very stringently, harshest sanctions ever. That von Leyen was saying that we want to hobble the economy, we want to degrade Russia's underlying economy and make it, slow it down, take away the tech so that it can't compete in the 21st century, was what Biden said. However, talking to the analysts, the sanctions don't have that power, it seems to me. I mean, they're going to cause a lot of pain. The ones that stood out, the banks, they're going to hit 70% of the banks and make it unable to deal in dollars, which is going to be a problem, but it doesn't actually cripple the economy, though, does it?
No, it doesn't. It certainly makes it more difficult to to conduct transactions and trade, etc. But it doesn't cripple the economy, no. And again, whether by accident or design, Russia's balance sheet has never been this strong. It's never been as in good a position. And it means, therefore, the government has got significant amount of financial firepower to provide subsidies, to cover any problems that emerge, to maintain jobs, to maintain stability, albeit at a low level, and you're not achieving diversification. And by perhaps big grand programs like the national goals and national projects now are substantially reduced or sidelined indefinitely because the money will be needed to maintain stability. But if the goal of sanctions is to destabilize the economy and cripple the economy or cause a financial crisis, well, that's just not going to happen. Forget it.
So look, then gas and oil sanctions
will restrain growth.
So gas and oil sanctions are off the table because you cause an energy crisis. SWIFT is off the table because you also caused an energy crisis, plus maybe destabilize European financial system. So they're not left with much. They're going after some oligarchs. They're going to hit the banks and make life difficult for them, but they won't
make life difficult. But that's it. That's a good way to put it. It is, sanctions make life more difficult, but they don't stop. And for example, let's just say, if you're in Russia and you need to transact with the US, up to now you just do that easily with Sberbank, but you can't do that. But instead, you just go and open a bank account, probably in a Halyk Bank in Nur-Sultan. And you can transfer money instantly from Sberbank to say Halyk Bank, just to use a name, and then Halyk Bank will transfer to you. So it's a bit more inconvenient, a little bit more cost, but it doesn't stop the trade.
My view on the sanctions is that individually they're ineffective. However, collectively, what they've done is they've forced Putin to build up this enormous reserves, to keep the debt extremely low, and to run an austerity budget, since
absolutely.
2014. Yeah. And then that limits the GDP to potential now is only 2%, and it should not be that. It should be double or 3 times.
I absolutely agree. Yeah,
and that's the actual cost of sanctions.
Yeah.
But Putin's also showed that, like I said before, because of this Soviet mentality, that security is more important than prosperity. And if people have to live a less prosperous life, so be it. It's your duty to the state. Because but this is again, go back to what we're saying about is that was absolutely 100% valid for people who are now, of that age group, pensioners or, etc., maybe public sector workers, etc. But the big question mark is how valid is that with the kind of emerging and faster growing population who've got different attitudes. I remember several years ago, actually just on this last point, it was years ago, I won't mention his name now publicly, but a former deputy minister, kind of younger generation who's been critical of government policies at various times, but he made a presentation at one of our briefings, a long time ago, pre-COVID, and he said, the good thing about Russia today is it's a very stable country. And then he stopped for a moment and he said, and the worst thing about the country today is that it's a very stable country. So, it's exactly that point, is that the mentality of the people at the top is that as long as you've got stability and people have got bread, everybody be happy. I would say that's now an enormously questionable thesis because of the shift in the population. And it's becoming less so every day.
And people in the Kremlin, I think at least a lot of people in the Kremlin understand that. which is why you now have this kind of much, I wouldn't say suppression, but much greater control over social media, internet, etc., because they're worried about losing control over this generation. And I think I agree with you. It's the accumulated effect of sanctions on investment and the ability to diversify and the ability to grow. It is anybody who thinks that sanctions are going to cripple the economy and cause a crisis, they're wrong. But it's the long-term effect.
Brings me to my last question, that everyone's been shocked again. Everyone's caught out. Russia has invaded, and it's not just like there was a referendum and the troops actually were already living there. There wasn't an invasion. Everyone keeps saying Crimea was invaded. It wasn't. However, this is a proper full-on invasion. It's as ugly as it gets. Has Russia now definitively wrecked its investment case? Because as I say before, everyone was like politely doing business and not talking about the problems. But now it's the enemy. I mean, is this going to wreck it? Are any investors going to buy equities, bonds, or all the foreign retailers over here? Are they going to bother reinvesting, or are they going to leave? I mean, is this the end of Russia as an investment story for Western Europe?
No, it's not. It's certainly, and clearly a lot depends on what happens next. And you really have to go back to those scenarios. If you have the scenario of full occupation and daily reports of sabotage and people being arrested and kind of old style Stasi, then probably we're closer to that negative scenario you talked about. Western companies reputationally, etc., would probably not be able to stay here, no matter how profitable it is in that scenario. But on the other hand, if Russia achieves an objective and then pulls back and you end up with this kind of more stable stalemate, then I don't think they will pull back. And because it is a profitable market and there is potential. But if you make it difficult for them to stay by having that, worst case scenario, then they'll leave and it'll become uninvestable. But what it has done, though, is it makes it more difficult for investors from the West. It makes it easier for investors from the East and maybe even the Middle East or subcontinent. And it makes it more difficult to attract investment into, shall we say, discretionary sectors. So, somebody who doesn't need to be in Russia, perhaps a consumer company or a service company, there's absolutely nothing now compelling for them to come to Russia whatsoever. On the other hand, if you're in a sector where Russia is dominant, such as energy or, climate management coming up, renewable energy coming up, the development of hydrogen, all these areas where Russia will also have a huge competitive advantage relative to others in the future, then you'll want to come here and you still want to come to Russia to be investing in those sectors. So I guess the bottom line is that what's happened now makes it more difficult for Russia to diversify its economy and to reduce the dependency on its traditional strengths. But it shouldn't make it any more difficult to continue the sort of investment into these sectors as we've seen in the past, unless the situation in Ukraine really gets a lot worse.
Do you know what? I actually think from this whole episode, it's tragic in the classic sense, because Russia came and wanted to do a security deal. The bottom line is that we have no intention of offering Ukraine NATO membership anytime soon, anytime, say, in the next decade. And that there was an opportunity to actually deal with all this dirty laundry, and had a security deal been done so that Putin felt a bit more confident, then he could scale down his fiscal fortress. Russia would have boomed, it would have prospered, investment would have come in because it becomes a boom market. And that's the basis of a good relationship. Look at Germany, post-war Germany compared to Germany today. And it's all gone pear-shaped, and we're now worse off than we were. And neither Russia nor the West are better off from this conflict.
No, there's absolutely. Well, no, I was going to say there's no winner from this. There is China. China has been able to get exposure to material supply. It has greatly strengthened its secure supply of materials for its economy, whether it's energy or coal or other materials. They're now coming across land on very secure lines from the world's biggest producer, both in Central Asia as well as Russia. And every time the Western company is not available to invest in a new project, China is there with its checkbook open if it suits the Chinese cause. So you can't say nobody's won from this crisis. The Chinese clearly have, and to a very great extent, but nobody else has.
On that note, Chris, thank you very much for participating. Fascinating, dark days, definitely. But
Yes.
I don't know, it's
Hope to
Russia.
get better.
Yes, we хотели как лучше, получилось как всегда. We always want the best and end up with what we always get. This is the Russia story, and it hasn't changed one bit. So thanks again. I hope to see you in Moscow soon.
Yeah, okay, look forward to it. Okay, bye.
Okay. And to the listeners, thank you very much for for participating. I hope you found that interesting. I'd like to plug the publication. If you're interested in all of this, then we're in our editor's picks. If you go to this website, Intellinews/welcome, you can sign up for editor's picks. At the moment, the editor's picks is all the reporting we're doing on the war every day for free, but it usually contains our best stories from the last 24 hours. Also, if you're in the game and you want to find out more about not just Russia, but all the countries, the former Soviet Union, Central Asia, down into North Africa, then I highly recommend you take a look at our premium service, the Pro, which you can sign up and try out for 2 weeks without cost. And on that note, I'd like to thank you very much. I shall see about organizing another meeting fairly soon. I'll let you know. All the best.